Today's episode of Expanded Perspectives is sponsored by Gaia.com. Help find your own truth by exploring perspectives you won't find in the mainstream on some of life's biggest mysteries. Whether it's grand conspiracies, breakaway societies, UFOs, ancient civilizations, lost wisdom, as well as the paranormal, all at your fingertips. Stream videos anywhere from your living room or on the go with access to over 7,000 titles, all available to you with a monthly plan for only $9.95 a month. If you sign up now, the first month is only 99 cents. There are multiple plans to choose from, including a 3-month plan and an annual plan. If you enjoy expanding your perspective, then you'll enjoy Gaia.com. Gaia.com. Gaia.com.
Howdy there, friends, and thanks again for joining us here on Expanded Perspectives. That's right, it's me, Cam, and as always, sitting across the table from me, we're not really hanging low today, but we've been a little tired because we was up a little late last night. It's my amigo, Mr. Kyle Filio Filson.
How's everyone doing out there? I feel pretty good. Yeah, I feel fine.
I lost my voice a little bit this morning.
Yelling and staying out late, yeah. It was a good time. We went to like we talked about before, the Craft and Cork.
Yes.
Which is a little festival here.
Now, you got to tell everybody, how many were there? You had talked to Dana, which Kyle used to do some work for some people that own a large liquor store here. And it used to be a small, I guess almost you could say if there was such a thing, a mom and pop. It was the first liquor store in our entire area, the very first one, because we used to be dry in this county. But they had a loophole. Right. They got it worked out, and they had it. Well, Kyle, of course, goes to work there right out of high school, I guess, wasn't it?
Yeah, right out of high school. Mm-hmm.
And then off and on, you worked there and we're not talking like full-time. We're talking like part-time. He'd go in there and work after work because, well, he's a glutton for it. So he liked having walking around money and all that stuff. But then she's the one that put it on. The man and the wife that still own it, she's the one that put all this on. But how many would you say was there as far as vendors last
I think
night?
There was about 75, 45 to 75, somewhere in that range. And that was all that they were allowed to have. It was much bigger by almost double than the previous year, which was the first year that they had it. And she told me that they had to turn down a ton. There was like 95 others that just weren't allowed in. She felt bad. She said, but you couldn't accept everybody. Yeah.
Now, folks, what this was all wineries from all around coming, and then also craft brewers from all around coming. And then, of course, me and Kyle, we didn't really partake in the wine.
I didn't have any wine.
We handled up on that cold beer while we was there, for sure. Because a lot of the craft breweries were from all over Texas, but there were some that was even had come down from Oklahoma. There was one, I think, from Colorado. I mean, there was several of them that had came down just all for this. That's something right there, folks. If you have a craft brewery in your area or one that you love, and I don't mean like, I don't need to see, I love
you guys
Shiner
ever heard
Bock.
of Sam Adams?
Yeah, you ever heard of Sam? I don't want to hear that. I'm talking about a tiny little craft brewery that basically only sells around your town that you're in. Email us a link to that, please. Send it to the show, expandedperspectives@yahoo.com. Email us that, because we would love to be able to get into, I would like to reach out, be able to order beer like that and try it from different places. It's fun. Me and Kyle enjoy doing all that, and it was fun. But I had a wonderful time. We had our wives, and here's what's funny. It ends up like we always laugh. It turned into a high school reunion, basically, when we got there. Yeah. There was roughly probably 1,500 people out there.
Yeah, I think that's all they allowed. Yeah.
And that's what it was. And then that's where they stopped it. They sold X amount of tickets. That was all you could get in. We get in there, and we ran into, I don't know, about 200 people we ended up knowing, and then the rest of us, about 30 of us, ended up that all of us didn't know the others was going, so it ended up being a big group, and it got pretty wild. So we had a wonderful, wonderful time. But enough with that. Enough with the talking about the drinking and the staying out late for two old men. It was too much. We got something interesting for you today,
No
folks.
news today.
No news. We're going to jump into an interview with one of our good friends. He came down several months ago. I guess it was in the spring when they came down, and we run into him and Mr. Red Pill Junkie and Micah and Greg Bishop and Tim Banal, yeah, and they all come down. We had a wonderful time. We were hanging out. We all even broke bread, sat around and had mixed drinks after we left the Aurora Cemetery and the Aurora crash site. We broke bread with Mr. Joshua Cutchin. And Joshua is going to be interviewed with us today. We're talking about his new book, folks. We're talking about the Brimstone Deceit. Now, we've interviewed him about the Trojan Feast, and it was awesome because he comes at all these tales at a different angle. That's what Kyle and I, we even talk about, we appreciate the most about it. And that's what he's done here, folks, except this one, instead of it being the food and the drink that could be from the extraterrestrial, the Fae, the Sasquatch, this is the smells. These are the smells that actually occur and the links of all these sightings of all these strange things. And somehow they seem to fall in one. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with Joshua, first of all, he's a native of North Carolina. Okay, folks? And also, he holds a master's in music literature and a master's in journalism from the University of Georgia. Yeah, so the fella's not just, blowing smoke. He actually has some background. He knows how to write, and he's an excellent writer. But he's a wonderful guy. He's a rock tuba player. I've never quite understood that. He's a great big guy, folks. I mean, he's a big son of a gun. He looks like he'd be playing football for the University of Georgia, not carrying a tuba. But anyhow, we did the interview with him. We had a wonderful time. Joshua was great. We think you're going to enjoy this. So on the end of the side of this break, we're going to get into the interview with Mr. Joshua Cutchin and the Brimstone Deceit. Stick around, folks. You're listening to Expanded Perspectives. All right, everybody, we have been around here killing time for almost an hour, talking amongst ourselves. I guess we better start recording this. Our brother in Georgia is on today with us, Mr. Joshua Cutchin, and we're going to be talking about the Brimstone Deceit. Brother, what are you doing right now?
All right. I woke up, I had some coffee. My wonderful wife brought me some bacon and an egg, which I wolfed down like a fat man that
like
I am.
A savage.
And, man, I have podcast fuel in my body, so let's go.
We are rocking and rolling. Okay, folks. Those of you that have probably already listened to Joshua's other interview he did with us on The Trojan Feast, his first book, which was awesome. Well, he's followed it up with one that me and Kyle have already kissed his butt enough about because we love this book. This one is what it even says on the cover. I love how you do it, but it's an in-depth examination of supernatural sense. You go into stuff in this book, man, that it never even dawned on me, and I know Kyle either. We've been talking about it since we got the book. It's the Trojan Feast did it with the food, and I was like, okay, man, he's done something nobody else has done. And then you bring this in and throw this to us, and we're just like, it's even crazier. Is there something that happened to you, maybe even after the book, before the book, whatever, that decided to have you do the smells? What spurred that one after Trojan Feast?
Well, a couple of different things. In a way, it's sort of a challenge because it doesn't sound like there's enough to write write on there. I remember when I first approached my publisher, Patrick Weege, in Anomalous Books, great guy, about A Trojan Feast. He was like, yeah, I don't know if there's enough here for an entire book. And then he read it and he said, oh, yeah, this is great. Let's go ahead and run with this. And this was sort of a similar thing. He actually kind of discouraged me from taking the smell route. And I'm like, let me prepare a presentation of all the data and the places that this could lead and then see what you think. And he read it and he's like, you know what? You've got the green light. Go ahead with that. So that's part of it. But also, talking about A Trojan Feast and the food and drink offerings from aliens, fairies, and Sasquatch, you sort of are led down naturally as a progression of the senses into sort of smell-like categories because taste and smell are so closely linked. I mean, not only does taste have a strong relationship with memory, but smell has an even stronger relationship with memory. You and I were just talking about that off air. You can – it basically bypasses all cognition and you automatically are thrust into like an emotional reaction when you smell certain smells from your past. So in my interests with the paranormal about, the role that it fills and the relationship that it has with the witness, it seems like it would be a sense that's really ripe for deception. So that was part of the launching point for this as well.
Well, and I didn't, to be honest, I had no idea that there were this many separations of smells that have been tied in with all this wild stuff. And when I say that, it's like I didn't know. We've always heard about the sulfur, and we've always heard about like ozone whenever there's certain things around. But when you started getting into these perfumes, there's cases that are people go into these haunted areas, or these presumably haunted areas, and they have these experiences with perfumes. And then you find out later on after the experience that there was a woman or an alleged woman's ghost in that area.
Yeah. And you know, sometimes those to me are the most interesting ones, where you'll have someone who isn't familiar with the property at all will go into a building and they'll smell something that turns out to be the favorite scent of someone who's passed away, or all of a sudden they'll be hit by a real strong whiff of cigar or cigarette smoke. Those are some of the most common smells that you run into in spirit cases. I use the term spirit cases because I think ghost specifically suggests the souls of the deceased, which I think might be the case in some instances, but in others, I don't think it is the case. So in this particular book, I use the whole spirit catch-all as an umbrella term for ghosts and demons and Blessed Virgin Mary apparitions and the Japanese yokai and all these sort of catch-all of these just basically non-corporeal beings that we refer to in a lot of folklore as spirits.
Yeah, and one of my favorite things, Joshua, is you bring up a good point. On this show, so often we talk about eyewitness accounts. I mean, it's a big part of our show, eyewitness accounts. And we talk about, when it comes to court trials and things, a lot of criminal trials are based on eyewitness accounts. And you bring up a great point that we often trust our eyes, we trust our ears, but, should we trust our noses? And that's what I find really interesting. And when it comes to that, can you tell us a few accounts from your book about these cases where people are picking up these smells, and some of the smells actually represent good or evil in the world? That's pretty cool.
Yeah, well, there's certain qualities that smells tend to have that reinforce basically a hedonic value, a value of objective positivity or negativity. And if you take a look at sort of the smells that are reported in the three major categories of this book, so spirits, UFOs / alien abduction, and Sasquatch, generally speaking, the more malignant an entity is, the fouler it will smell. For example, female ghosts tend to smell like perfume, and apparitions of the Blessed Virgin Mary almost always are accompanied by some sort of floral odor. If in the early contactee literature, folks like Orfeo Angelucci, beautiful feminine space sisters, as it were, had sort of a floral smell as well. Then if you look at entities that are perceived as negative, like abducting gray aliens, or an angry Sasquatch, or demonic activity, those are often accompanied by foul smells. And one of the most common foul smells, which is also the place where the book gets its title, is the smell of sulfur. And that was sort of really another one of those points that made me sit back and say, somebody needs to examine why there's this common sulfur smell throughout all paranormal activity. And of course, that involves sort of having to break down what people are really smelling when they say that they're smelling sulfur, because more often than not, they're not smelling sulfur. Sulfur actually doesn't have a smell if it's pure. They're smelling some sort of sulfur compound. So really trying to parse that out was one of the more difficult parts of the book, because there's just so much data and trying to figure out what people describe versus what people are actually smelling. There's a phenomena called tip of the nose that a lot of olfactory scientists discuss, which is the idea that you can almost recognize a smell, but you can't exactly pinpoint it. And also, going back to this idea of being able to trust our noses, a lot of the way that we interpret smells is context dependent. So if I were to take Cam and you and blindfold you, like where this is going, right? And
Kyle does. He loves that.
And take a piece of Parmesan cheese and hold it under Kyle's nose and say that I'm making Italian tonight, he's going to smile. And if I hold that same piece of Parmesan cheese under Cam's nose and say, hey, I just puked over there in the corner, like this is going to be a different reaction. So a lot of the way that we react to smells is really context driven.
That I never thought. That's so crazy.
Yeah,
You're right. That's 100% right. Especially like you're talking about. But it's the thing that they don't, like you said, it's context driven, but it's also that thing to where the people that weren't aware that there was something there till afterwards, like they still smelled a smell. Okay, what I keep going back to is the Gold Hill Hotel. When you started talking about that, you talked about Rosie. Can you tell them about that story? Because that was a fascinating story.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to. So the Gold Hill Hotel is an old hotel in Virginia City, Nevada, and there are two ghosts that people commonly report in there. One is William, who is a ghost that is whose presence is signaled by the smell of cigar smoke, and another one is Rosie, who is a prostitute who died but was known by her cheap smell of rose perfume. So it was actually a case where a psychic investigator named Richard Sennett was taking a bath in the hotel, and he detected this like overpowering smell of this rose perfume all of a sudden. And he checked all the soaps and checked the windows, and he checked basically, he exhausted every possibility for where the smell could be coming from, and he couldn't find the reason, for it to have appeared at all. And then just as soon as it had appeared, it ended, just as quickly, almost like somebody had flipped a switch. He examined the balcony in the hallway to make sure that no one was out there spraying rose perfume. And of course it was 2 a.m. at the time, so no one was. It's interesting that you see this, this tendency for smells to sort of abruptly appear and abruptly disappear, which to me is suggestive of the fact that there's something deliberate about these smells. I mean, if you look at something like, which we can talk about a little bit later, the UFO phenomena seems to be completely in control of its appearance. We haven't caught anything. All our video footage is pretty sketchy at best. They seem to be in control of the situation. So if the UFO intelligence can control the experience to that degree, then the smells that are chosen must have some sort of purpose, or must be chosen for a specific reason. Now, of course, I know some people might be saying, well, you're talking about UFOs now, you were talking about ghosts then. The smells that you see there's too much of a consistency between different categories that I don't think you can really separate these out as easily as we want to. And I don't know if that means that we're looking at different sides of the same thing, or different things with using similar methods, but there's something connecting all this together.
You're 100%. There has to be something. We even talked about that. There's too many little threads that tie it all in there for it not to be, like we've said, you don't want to put it under the whole one sweeping brush or all of one umbrella, but you almost have to. You almost have to look, because there's almost too much evidence to go, this is somehow linked. It's all one big circle that we still can't explain. I mean, reading the cases, I was going through some of the cases. Well, of course, one of my favorites to think about personally is the one from Tombstone at the OK Corral, where they talk about, what they smell in the cigars there, and then all the things that they smell there, because you would be like, okay, I get that, and it could be lingering from all kinds of things. I know when they talk about the music box that you speak of, and it's kind of like having a humidor. Like if there were cigars left in there, especially if they were smoked and put back in there, they can leave that residue. But the problem with that is when you start talking about people having experiences outside, like at Gettysburg, and we've covered that. Well, then now you're talking about something that's not lingering or not stuck in something unless it's stuck in the fabric of time.
Right. This sort of represents a problem that you run into when examining spirit smells, is because unlike the other major areas of inquiry in this book, and like I said, I go into UFOs and Bigfoot and actually a lot of different things like lake monsters and dogmen and chupacabras. So that's sort of the end of the book. But ghost smells are different because people often will not see an entity but smell something. And you have to be very careful because there is a neurological condition known as phantasmia. Now, some people, especially in ghost hunting communities, have said, well, phantasmia is whenever you smell a ghost smell, and that's not true. Phantasmia would be like the three of us sitting in a room, and I say all of a sudden, hey, do you smell burnt toast? And nobody else does. Phantasmia is a neurological condition, usually a signifier of a very much more serious underlying condition. So that's not what phantasmia is. But in cases where you have a single person noticing a smell, it's possible that might be an explanation for what's happening. So you sort of have to be more careful about that. The other thing that I find really fascinating in spirit stories is that every time you read about smells, in spirit tales. If people smell smoke, it's a man. And if people smell perfume, it's a woman. Despite the fact that women smoked just as much as men in years past, and that men have used cologne since ancient times. So I wonder, a good friend and mentor of mine is UFO author Greg Bishop, who'd be a great guest to have on the show. But he's been talking lately about just sort of the role of co-creation. Like, so what, in his words, what do we bring to the dance? How do our expectations sort of mold these paranormal experiences with something that is, I believe, an objective other intelligence, but where do we sort of share in the creation of these experiences? I think that's a really fascinating question for me.
Well, and you're right, because you even write about it with Alma in Alma, Colorado, the whole thing, and you cover part of that whole deal is what, there's so much interaction. Like, I like the fact that you'd point that out, that there is a neurological disorder that some people could have that problem, but what's the odds of everybody that has that problem visiting Gettysburg? When you start breaking that, you look at that, you're like, whoa, wait a minute.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like, so in that example of the three of us in a room where I'm the only one smelling burnt toast. Well, if all three of us smell burnt toast, then that implies some sort of objective.
Well, I know we're all crazy, but I mean,
yeah, exactly.
That's where that goes. Yeah.
But yeah, so that's sort of those are the stronger cases that you have to look at, are the cases where people visiting an area report similar smells. The case in Alma, Colorado is a really weird one, because in 1908, some people were leaving the saloons after midnight. Of course, yeah, leaving the saloons after midnight. They must have been drunk, so they're hallucinating. Whatever. Anyway, but people, a large contingent of the town claimed to have seen some sort of spectral entity. Now, what's fascinating about the Alma case is that half the people said that it looked like a beautiful woman clad in white who smelled like perfume of roses and violets, whereas another half of those people said that it looked like a giant elephant that had like fire coming from its nose and it smelled like brimstone. So now, I've known some women who, no, just kidding.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But
Kyle used to date one.
Yeah, exactly. But to take a more serious angle, it's, that time of the century would imply that perhaps there's some newspaper hoax shenanigans going on, but that's kind of a stupid story to hoax. Like, why would you add in that detail about people seeing something so different? I think you'd either stick to ghost elephant or the ghost lady, one way or the other, if you were fabricating a newspaper hoax whole cloth. So I wonder, in that case particularly, if we can take that as some sort of genuine reportage, I wonder if perhaps it's not the product of what people were expecting to see in that case. And again, some people might get upset and say, he's saying that it's all in your head. No. I'm saying that about 50% of it's in your head, and the other 50% is something objective that a lot of us just have no context or framework to understand.
Mm-hmm. No way to judge it and wrap it around what your way, especially then. It wasn't maybe so widely viewed as it is now. Yeah, you're right with that. Well, okay, let's take another step. Let's go forward into where you see things and you have smells, and you bring up the sulfur smell when people start seeing UFOs. And I know a lot of people are always like, well, then that's the byproduct of their exhaust systems. But that may not necessarily be really anything to do with it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some people will probably push back on this claim that I have that sulfur is one of the more common UFO smells. But it's like I've said before, if you take all these different cases in aggregate, it might not be a majority of smells that are sulfuric in the unexplained. It might be what you call a plurality. So if anybody doesn't know in the audience, if Hillary Clinton gets 51% of the vote, she's gotten a majority of the vote. If she gets 40% of the vote and Trump gets 30% and Gary Johnson gets another 30%, then she has a plurality of the vote, right? So that's the difference. It's the largest contingent of something, but it's not that 51 plus. So I suspect that sulfur smells are a plurality of cases in the literature. And there is a suggestion that perhaps some sort of technology could leave behind a sulfurous odor. I mean, for example, our cars produce sulfur dioxide, which is more commonly known as that sort of gunpowder or fireworks smell. But you would most of the sulfur smells that people detect are not of that inorganic variety. And what I mean by this, so if it's all right, let's talk a little bit about sulfur in general. I had mentioned how sulfur is actually non-odoriferous in its basic state. When sulfur is burnt, it produces sulfur dioxide, which is that fireworks smell that I mentioned. But one of the most common smells that people mean when they say that something smells like sulfur is hydrogen sulfide, H2S, which is the smell of rotten eggs that we all know, and I think we all associate that with sulfur. It's one of the primary malodorant components in flatus, in intestinal gas, to put it politely, and it occurs whenever you have the decomposition of organic material in the absence of oxygen, which is why you smell it in swamps, which is why you smell it in sewers, which is why you smell it in rotten eggs. It's an organic compound. Like, you don't normally find hydrogen sulfide produced by a lot of industrial applications. It does some, but like for the most part, it's an organic smell. So the fact that it's an organic smell to me suggests that it isn't like UFO exhaust. There are plenty of cases where that do sound like UFO exhaust, like, chemical smells from UFOs, which I talk about in the book as well. Ozone is actually a pretty common, probably the second most common UFO smell that I've found. But the idea that hydrogen sulfide might somehow be some sort of UFO exhaust is not. It doesn't resonate with me in any real meaningful way.
There's like you said, it may be the plurality of the group of sulfur, but when you bring up ozone, there's a lot, because that would make more sense. The idea of ozone being from something maybe extraterrestrial, the way it operates, to me would make more sense than, because I have to deal with it in my line of work with the idea of the sulfur, and the gases and things. We have to deal with these things to make sure. So I understand where you're coming from with those odors, and it's funny to think of those. Anything that I deal with, like you said, that's outside of something natural, something more, of a regular non-mechanical smell, because to me, that's always done in an organic fashion. And it's like we talked about, could it be that, I guess, like you're talking about, it's linked in some way, because there's more in that group with this organic smell, and then you get these ozone smells, which makes more sense, because the organic it doesn't make sense that it's bumping out a sulfurous smell just because you're being around it. Because I understand it with the decomp, like we talked about off air. That's always like a way that I guess before maybe we developed, whatever it was, the way that things are rotten without being able to see them is through smell. The human mind, you can differentiate the smell of rotting food in your refrigerator. You open up a bag of lunch meat. Whoa, that's gone bad. Whereas if you didn't have that ability, you would just eat it. And then you're sick, you die off, whatever. So you understand the idea of the rotting smell, the decomp. That is kind of ingrained in us as evil, as something that we know that's not good. Sulfur is much like that. The human body, we know that's not good. When you get around that, that's not right. There's something not right. So but it doesn't, those don't line up with the UFO sightings, yet the majority of the ones that you bring up have that smell. And it's so crazy, because it should not be linked together. I understand the ozone. The ozone to me makes perfect sense. It's way easier for me to wrap my head around there's an ozone smell, or I guess with ozone, a lack of smell around where those things are at, than it would be with the sulfurous smell.
Well, if you look at why ozone would appear in nuts and bolts spacecraft sightings from another world, it's produced via electricity. It has a sterilizing effect. A lot of times people see lights on UFOs that are either blue or purple, which would suggest the possibility of a photochemical creation of ozone in the area. So yeah, it definitely makes sense. And what you find if you look back at the literature, certain investigators have said, well, when people say that they're smelling sulfur, they're just smelling ozone. I have a big problem with that. Number one, I don't think most people know what ozone smells like. Which does suggest the fact that they're misidentifying sulfur, but at the same time, if I am from the big city and I go into the countryside and I say that I saw a bunch of horses and some of them were mules, that doesn't mean that there weren't any horses, or that horses might not actually be the majority of what I saw, even though there were some mules. And if you're going to call into question that aspect of witness testimony, then you have to start calling into question all aspects of witness testimony. And before long, you're saying that people are mistaking Venus for a flying saucer. What is frustrating, and this is something that I have to go to in the book, is that for the longest time, sulfur and ozone were conflated. People thought that, for example, the classicists used to talk about strikes of lightning producing a sulfurous smell. And people used to talk about the seaside smelling of healthy ozone when it was actually dimethyl sulfide. So, yeah, there's definitely some historical confusion there. But you have to address... So you have to address the fact that we are so finely tuned to know what sulfur smells like. It's hardwired into us.
Mm-hmm.
My favorite analogy is if you were to take an ink dropper and put one drop of ink into the back of a semi filled with water, that is twice the concentration at which we can smell hydrogen sulfide. We can smell hydrogen sulfide at 0.47 parts per billion. And that's an average within the population. There are some people that can actually smell it in smaller amounts. So it's there for an evolutionary purpose. We are wired to recognize it. I think that we should assume that when people say that they're smelling sulfur or some sort of sulfur compound in UFO encounters, that they probably are. That seems to me like the most genuine and intellectually honest way to approach it.
And in turn, it usually means danger. That's what it's for. It's a telltale sign of something bad that can affect us in a negative way. And we have this, like you said, hardwired for millennia into us. We be able to smell it. So like you said, I understand people saying that they smell ozone and things, but when someone comes out and says, I smell sulfur, you can pretty much guarantee they're smelling sulfur. You pretty much bank on that.
I think the cases where people actually smell ozone, they rarely say that. Well, there are some people who are in certain professions that, like you, can identify ozone when they smell it. But I'm much more inclined to say that when people say that they smell an electrical smell or a peppery smell or even like a piney smell, that they're smelling ozone. They're just trying to describe it. It's that tip of the nose phenomena that we mentioned earlier.
There you go. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the reason that we're so sensitive to, in particular, hydrogen sulfide is because it's lethal. You don't want to mess around with it.
Yes.
In proper concentrations, it will totally kill you. Which is interesting because if you compare it to the use of pure sulfur in antiquity, sulfur has a long-standing reputation as a fumigant and as an antimicrobial agent. I mean, in the Judeo-Christian literature, God's breath was compared to a blast of sulfur because it had this cleansing effect, which really sort of reframes the way that you think about the smell of demons and Satan in Western tradition. Is Satan didn't want to be thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone. The effort of throwing Satan into the lake of fire and brimstone in the Christian tradition was to try and cleanse Satan of his evil. So the fact that demons and Satan traditionally smell like sulfur doesn't mean that they're bad and they smell bad. It means that that's the attempt of the divine to cleanse the evil of those particular intelligences.
Hence the Brimstone Deceit.
Yeah.
You've snuck it in on us.
Man, you're blowing me away. I'm learning quite a bit. Like, I had no idea that humans were so perceptive to the smell of sulfur. You said like so many parts per billion. I wonder if that's why they infuse propane gas with that exact smell, because we're most sensitive to that.
Why.
It is, yeah.
And that's the thing that you find is not only do people straight up report sulfur, but a lot of times they'll report things in all these encounters, spirits, UFOs, Sasquatch, where the primary malodorous component is sulfur. There was a case from Massachusetts in the 70s where someone said that they smelled what smelled like kitchen gas. Kitchen gas doesn't smell. Kitchen gas has methanethyl added to it to actually make it smell.
Right.
Similarly, there are some witnesses who claim that UFOs and obviously Bigfoot smell like skunk. Well, guess what one of the primary components in skunk spray is? It's thiols. Thiol is a term that's another term for a sulfur compound. For example, because of sulfur had this connotation with the divine in antiquity. Thiol and theon were similar words where we get theology from, the study of the divine. So that's where that term comes from, interestingly enough. But yeah, like a lot of things that we don't realize, that have a stinky quality are actually, it's because of sulfur that they have that awful quality. I mean, you look at decomposition. Not only is there hydrogen sulfide release in decomposition, but there's also several other compounds. For example, dimethyl trisulfide, I believe, is one of them as well. There's other components like cadaverine and putrescine and some other things, but it's it's a lot of things that smell bad because of decomposition.
Yeah, it's we just take for granted how powerful the sense of smell is. I mean, I guess I never really think about it on a daily basis, but they market stuff specifically, like they'll have scents that smells like the ocean or things like that. And I can remember when I go to like a baseball game, like I smell the ballpark. Like I can sit here right now and tell you what it smells like to go to the baseball game. I can walk into a hockey rink, like to watch an NHL game or something, and that smell of that rink, it reminds me of when I used to play. Like I can sit here now and think about it. And even like, if I think about Thanksgiving or Christmas, I can conjure up those ideas in my mind. So it does kind of make sense if you're thinking of a past loved one, that you can almost sense the smell of them, even if you're not even seeing them. Which brings me to, you were talking about certain things, like malevolent beings have a certain odor to them compared to a benevolent being. It's often funny to me that Sasquatch is always presumed as a gentle giant. He's a nice guy in the woods. He doesn't mean anybody any harm. But yet almost all the odors ever associated with Sasquatch are always this decomposing trash, terrible smell. What did you find in your research that either confirms that or goes against that?
It's interesting. I found one case where somebody said Sasquatch smelled pleasant, and I don't really put a lot of stock in that case. Not only because it, doesn't really fit with the overall trends, but it also just doesn't make sense in a lot of ways. So a lot of the smells that you find with Sasquatch, not only do you find plenty of stories that have this hydrogen sulfide component, but a lot of times you'll find tales that are smelly in a less offensive way. Like, in other words, things that we perceive as being smelly because we live quote unquote civilized lives. So in theory, like not rotten egg, but wet dog is not really, it shouldn't be an offensive smell. If we were living as cavemen, it wouldn't be an offensive smell. But in modern society, it's not considered pleasant to have that wet dog smell. So you do run into like wet dog smells. You run into like urine smells, all really natural smells, but they don't have that same extreme negative connotation. As opposed to something like that our bodies actually realize is dangerous, like hydrogen sulfide. But it's interesting, so A Trojan Feast was very unsympathetic to the extraterrestrial hypothesis, and in some ways quite sympathetic to the flesh and blood Bigfoot hypothesis. The inverse is true with this book. I think this book is actually more sympathetic to the ETH and more antagonistic toward the idea that Bigfoot is a flesh and blood creature. So I propose, because if you really want to be honest, there are plenty of high strange Sasquatch stories, so many that you can't discount them. And yet there are plenty of Sasquatch stories that sound like they're describing something that's a flesh and blood creature. So what I tended to notice is that when you've had Sasquatch that were exhibiting this sort of high strangeness, by which I mean disappearing or having glowing eyes that actually shot laser beams, or during UFO flaps, all these tended to have more of a hydrogen sulfide quality to them, versus a lot of the Sasquatch that people would see, running around the woods have more of an animalistic smell, like a urine smell or a fecal smell or a decompositional smell. So I wonder and suggest that perhaps the nose isn't giving us a clue as to the origins of these things. And what I mean by that is, have you guys had Mike Cleland on the show?
No, but we have spoken to him. Okay,
so you're familiar with Mike's work.
Mm-hmm.
So for those people who don't know, Mike Cleland is sort of the owl guy. He's pointed out the recurring appearance of owls, not only in abduction experiences, possibly as screen memories, but also in sort of synchronistic events that have happened with people who are UFO experiencers. None of this is to say that Mike doesn't think that there aren't flesh and blood owls flying through forests. To the contrary, he obviously acknowledges that. But at the same time, owls can sometimes be stranger, and their imagery can sometimes be co-opted in a way by something of a more unexplained nature. So what I suggest is there might be a possibility that there is a flesh and blood entity out there, flesh and blood undiscovered hominid, whose appearance is sometimes co-opted by stranger phenomena, not unlike the way that the appearance of the owl is sometimes co-opted. And that perhaps the smell reported in these encounters, the hydrogen sulfide smell versus the other more animalistic smells, might be some sort of clue as to exactly which is which.
Right. So, Joshua, with all your work and research on this book, whether it's spirit stories, Sasquatch stories, UFOs, or any other lesser-known cryptids, are there any that stand out to you as one of your favorites?
Well, one of the cases that I think you definitely have to talk about if you're going to write a book about paranormal smells is the Mad Gasser of Mattoon. Not Mattoon. I actually read some online forums where some residents of Mattoon were like, you don't buy a mattress to sleep on, you buy a mattress. So it's Mattoon, Illinois. And for 2 months in the summer of 1944, 20 people encountered this tall individual dressed in like dark clothing with a tight-fitting cap who used to spray some sort of gas into people's houses. One of the first victims was an individual who he awoke in the middle of the night and felt nauseous and weak, and there was this odd odor in the air. He vomited, and he thought maybe it was a malfunction with his pilot light, which again suggests that it smelled like hydrogen sulfide. But then he found that there was no problem, and his wife at that point was paralyzed by this odor. And some neighbors experienced some similar problems, and this was a huge flap that happened. It was, a lot of people cite it as one of those examples of mass hysteria, because many people not only experienced the smell, but there were also sightings of this person spraying things with an atomizer into people's bedroom windows. There was actually a handkerchief that was left behind that supposedly, if you smelled it, would give the same symptoms that the gasser's victims would have, like nausea and paralysis. Whenever people described smells, the actual smell, one person said that it was a sickeningly sweet smell that was coming from flowers outside of the window. But you'll also find, the official answer from the Mattoon Police Department was that there were the scent of carbon tetrachloride that was coming from a nearby diesel engine plant. And some of the effects of carbon tetrachloride poisoning do have sort of a similar sort of experience as to what the people who are the victims of the Mad Gasser experienced. But it's just as possible that, again, people could be smelling hydrogen sulfide. If you look at the way that the human nose reacts to hydrogen sulfide, you've got the detection level, which is about half of a part per billion. And then as it gets as that concentration increases, you actually hit a threshold where it smells sickeningly sweet. Above, I think it's above 30 parts per million. And then even farther above that, you actually don't smell it at all, which is part of the reason that it's so dangerous. So the question really still stands as to exactly the motivations of the Gasser of Mattoon. No one died that I'm aware of in this case, in this flap. But we still don't know the motives, and it was just one of those weird Fortean things. It actually kind of feels a lot like the clown wave we have going around, where people are seeing these strange figures that seem up to good. Yeah.
He's just begging to get shot. The Mad Gasser's just asking for a round is what he's doing.
Yeah, he's being a peeping Tom and trying to, poison people, I guess, through their windows.
You bring up something, too, when we were talking about the Sasquatch that I've been meaning to ask you about, because there's different camps of people when they start talking about Sasquatch. Some believe it's a flesh and blood creature. Some believe it's interdimensional. Some believe it's extraterrestrial. There's all these. They went to breaking that down now into sections instead of just saying, okay, it's a primate. But I like when you're covering the fact that there's several sightings where people claim to have smelled garbage on those primates. In particular, there was a bow hunter in Pennsylvania that you talk about that saw like a group of 4 or 5 or however many, a whole family pretty much of Sasquatch, and he said that they left behind a garbage-like odor. If it's an interdimensional creature, I wouldn't think it'd be prodding around in the trash to bring on that trashy smell.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the thing. If it's an interdimensional creature, then I don't think that. I mean, you have tales where people supposedly find unidentified scat in the woods that they think is Bigfoot. So Bigfoot's using this dimension as a toilet. That's not very. It's not very polite,
right?
It's interesting. So there was a great article that I recommend that anybody who reads the book check out. UFO Smells from UFOs by Antonio F. Rulon, and in that particular article, he proposed several means of determining the source of odors in UFO encounters. Meaning, is it purely from the craft? Is it from the craft's interaction with the environment? Is it purely from the environment? I sort of ended up proposing a similar method for a similar rubric for sort of describing Bigfoot smells. So you got to look at endogenous intentional, produced in the body, released intentionally, which would be something like a scent gland. Exogenous intentional, which would be something that's if, for example, some people have claimed that Bigfoot might harvest the scent gland of skunks and rub it on its body. That would be exogenous intentional, originating outside the body but applied intentionally. Endogenous intentional, which would be like the smells of, Bigfoot it just happens to smell like body odor because he's sweating and stuff. Or the last one, which is the one we're talking about, exogenous unintentional, which is a byproduct of the environment. So Bigfoot sleeps in a moldy cave, and that's the reason that he smells like, hydrogen sulfide, because there's a hot spring in the cave. Or, in this case, Bigfoot's digging through trash and ends up smelling like garbage. Again, you've got to acknowledge these underlying themes of decomposition that occur in with decay and garbage. One of the primary components in this sort of rotten cabbagey kind of decay compost smell is dimethyl sulfide. We got another sulfur smell here. But yeah, and that would be one of those cases, that garbage smell, or that anything that has that really strong garbage or decompositional rot smell. That to me sounds like we're dealing with something a little bit more, as mundane as Bigfoot can be, right?
Yeah, right.
A little bit more mundane, yeah.
Well, and there's even a part where you were talking about there's, I guess you call them anomalous smells of various creatures and entities and things, and you go into several of them. But we always go back to the fact that I'm a big fan of simplicity, and I love the fact of thinking that these things are actual flesh and blood creatures. I like that. And there's a part in here where you're talking about water monster sightings, and they're actually, a man reports as seeing one. I believe seeing Champ is actually what he reports, and claims that it smelled like a snake. And for those of you that have never smelled one, we always talk about copperheads. They're bad down here in Texas. You can smell them. They smell kind of like decaying leaves, but they do have a snaky smell to them. And any snake I've ever been around, I mean, even whenever they're kept in homes, when you get them out, they have a certain smell to them. So for him to report that he smelt the snaky, skunky smell of, yet again, we go back into that sulfur smell with that skunky claim, but that snaky smell, it just seems to me, it feels to be more of a flesh and blood creature. And I really appreciate that.
Yeah. It's kind of funny. I've gotten some flack on some Reddit posts, not that I made, but other people talking about sort of my work, and
haven't we all?
They've sort of right? It means that you're actually going somewhere, right? But really sort of challenging the idea that I think Bigfoot might be weirder than just a flesh and blood creature. I don't want that to happen. I want Bigfoot to be, a giant monkey man running around the forest, because that means we might actually get an answer someday.
Yeah.
But if I'm honest, there are some things that happen that really make me question whether or not that's the answer. But I do think that this concept of using the nose to identify and separate between high strange cryptids and more mundane animalistic cryptids is probably has some legs to it. And you're right. That particular case was Dennis Hall had apparently encountered what he thinks was a champ crossing the road in a swamp. His fellow researcher Elizabeth had actually earlier that day heard the sound of something running into Lake Champlain and noticed a similar musky odor. So yeah, I mean, snakes stink. I don't think a lot of people realize that. We don't think about reptile having a smell, but if you've ever walked into a reptile specialist pet shop, whew, that can be a big stink.
Yeah, for sure it can.
Yeah, it's a very interesting book, and I urge everybody to go out and get it. I've never really contemplated your thought process on this, and that's what I find so intriguing about this book and your last one, A Trojan Feast. Tell people where they can find your book. Tell them about what shows you're on other than just appearing on podcasts. And do you have a website, Joshua?
Yeah, so the answer to all those questions, my online presence is joshuacutchin.com. I have an ill-maintained blog there that I try to get a post up probably about once a month. But I do catalog all of my podcast appearances on there. You can also hear me on Where Did the Road Go, which is it's a podcast on wheredidtheroadgo.com. I do weekly roundtables with Soraya Azkath, Red Pill Junkie, and Michael Hughes. And the book, The Brimstone Deceit, as well as my first book, A Trojan Feast, are both available from Amazon and Barnes & Noble. A Trojan Feast is available in hardcover, paperback, and e-reader, so Kindle formats. And the Brimstone Deceit right now is just available in paperback and e-reader formats. And so far it's ebook, Kindle, something called a Kobo. I don't even know what that is, but there are 4 or 5 formats there. So it should be very available for people to pick their poison on that.
That's awesome. And I'll put links to all that stuff in our show notes. Thank you so much for coming on again. And I cannot wait to meet you again in person. I remember the last time you came down to Dallas, we went to Dealey Plaza. Me and you and Micah Hanks went and had a sandwich. And then we also met
it was a good time.
In Aurora.
Yep.
And then we all went and had some drinks there before you guys left. So that was really cool.
Yeah, it was a great time. And it's always a pleasure to speak with you guys. It's like the hair club for men.
Yeah,
I'm a client as well.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, I listen to Expanded Perspectives religiously, so it's always a pleasure to speak with you guys.
As far as conferences or anything, are you doing any public speaking anywhere?
Nothing on the books just yet. There's some stuff that's in the works, but I'm going to sort of hold my tongue on it a little bit because I don't want to jinx myself. So we'll see.
Right on. Well, I can't wait for you to release another one and then get back down here to Texas and we'll go look at some of the spots that you cover in this book.
Oh, I plan on coming back to God's country. You better believe it.
Right on. Thanks, brother.
And we're back with Expanded Perspectives. An excellent interview, an excellent story, an excellent book. I love his books. Like I said, I read, and I know you do too, Cam, hundreds of books every year on the various topics that we discuss, whether it's ancient civilizations, ancient history, cryptozoology, UFOs. And, several of them are good, some of them not so good. But a lot of them explore the same things. Like if an author has an interesting idea or concept or theory on, say, UFOs, for instance, there usually at least some point in the book will mention the Roswell incident. They'll mention the Betty and Barney Hill abduction. They'll mention, UFOs interfering with nuclear missiles at Maelstrom. All these typical cases, which are all interesting cases. But if you do it enough and you read it enough, you read the same stories so much. What I like about Joshua Cutchin's books is they are completely different than what everybody else is doing. I mean, like they said, The Trojan Feast, without a doubt, was my favorite book of 2015. And once again, 2016 is almost wrapped up. He comes out with this new book, The Brimstone Deceit. And once again, I have to say it's one of my favorite ones because I never really gave much consideration
to the association with odors and smells along with paranormal events.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it does. It reminded me of, you know, I've heard it in the past. I just never drew the connections. Is when somebody smells like, say they had a grandfather and he always used to smoke this pipe. And then people will think about their grandfather for whatever reason, just out of the blue, and all of a sudden they'll like smell that fragrance, or they'll think, and it'll remind them of that. And smell really is one of our strongest senses, ones that stays with us far beyond eyewitness accounts and things like that. A very interesting book, excellent read. I'll put links to it in the show notes. I suggest you buy it if you're into the paranormal, into this stuff. I loved it, and I like his writing style. And then Joshua is generally a very sincere and great guy. Like I said in the intro, we've met with him before personally. Very intelligent, and he does these appearances on Where Did the Road Go with Zariah Askath. That's an excellent podcast. If you've never heard of that, you should check that out too. What do you think? What'd you think?
I loved it. I love the book. The whole thing about it is because the obscurity of something. I love whenever somebody brings forward something that we've never thought of, and you kind of sit back and feel. And I even told him, I go, this feels like a book that should have been written 50 years ago, because it feels like we've gone past. At great speed, the scientific method of looking at some of these things. We try to, we thought we could nail it down real quick, and then we can't nail down all this stuff. We have to go back and reevaluate. And this feels like something, start small, kind of like in a crime scene. You look at the crime scene where you got to basically, tear down each and every step of that crime scene to figure it out. That's kind of the way his books are. And that's what I like. It's like, man, why wasn't this written years ago for people to talk about the food, the drink? Okay, how does that tie together? Okay, how does the smells tie together? Because it almost feels, if you get done reading it, like a lot more things are related than what we thought. And that's what I love about it. Folks, I even talk about, you heard me in the interview, bringing up the idea of, like, could it have been UFO exhaust at one point? Well, there's a few little things in here that comes from the book that I really enjoyed, and I want to read these real quick to you. There's a couple of cases that talk about a funny odor that had to do with this UFOs and these sightings. One took place in 1957. There was a South African witness, and they gone on to claim that she was looking out of her window and she saw something zigzagging, and what she said was a moon, what she actually called herself the moon. That it was moving around and it actually morphed and all that. But what she said after it departed her from where she was at, that she smelled an odor like an overheated radio. So like a burnt plastic smell. Well, there's another one. There's a couple of the Bud Hopkins abduction subjects named Alice and Carol that he writes about in here. And they said after their encounter that they remembered this, a rubber acrid smell of burnt wiring.
Yeah, see?
Now that's pretty wild, right?
Pretty similar.
Well, exactly. Now, it could be them trying to talk about what the smell ozone is, but ozone doesn't really smell like burnt wiring. There's another one from Las Cruces, New Mexico in 1967, where somebody said that they had seen and observed a UFO and the smell of burnt electrical insulation this time. So you start linking these together, and you're kind of like, man, what is going on here? Yet again, it goes back into what we say. It feels like it's man-made. When you start having some sort of smell, I would, because I'm like, man, I could understand a pure ozone smell if it was magnetic, but burnt wiring sounds like something you or I built and what you're trying to fly around in there. So, but either way, folks, whatever you believe, whatever you want to believe, this is a book that I highly suggest. You need to read this. If nothing else, it gives you some ideas to put into your own theories. I loved it. I couldn't get enough of it. I mean, Anomalist did a great job with it, and the cover is also great. A nose. Just sticking out of the book, just a nose, the Brimstone Deceit. You see it, you would think it was like some sort of a lady novel. You're like, look at this pretty white book. No, it's some sweet lady novel is what you would expect. But I loved it. Joshua, sir, thank you so much for coming on and doing that with us, and we hope y'all enjoyed it, folks.
All right. So what do you got planned for the week?
Man, I have got a lot of sampling to do, and I've got a lot of stuff to set up. I've got like I told you, we're getting some new equipment at work.
Right.
And so I'm familiarizing myself with new equipment, and it's going to be hectic. It won't be bad. It's just going to be hectic. Also, too, folks, for those of you that don't follow us on Instagram, a big shout out to a training partner and good friend of ours, Mr. Dylan Ashburn, the Irish Dragon.
That's right.
He fought on the prelims of the Legacy fights this Friday night on Access TV. Now they didn't televise it. I know they filmed it, but they didn't televise it. So hopefully I can get some and I may post it up on Facebook or something like that. But he won 3rd round by KO over a young man named Devin that he has actually trained with before. I've met Devin. He's a great guy. And it's one of those things you don't ever want to see somebody lose that you really know. You know, it was a no-win situation. You're like, I don't want either one to lose, but Dylan's a training partner, you know, and Devin really isn't. So I'm like, okay, man, I understand what has to happen here. But it's a great fight. Both of them are warriors.
Yeah,
I mean,
awesome
it was
job.
back and forth. It was a good battle. But, yeah, it was a KO. Stopped him. So, you know, my hat's off to Dylan. Congrats, sir. Well done. And, Devin, I hope you're better and I hope you shake that off and get back in there again soon. So, and then coming up a couple weeks, another good friend of the show, good friend of ours, and training partner, Mr. Dakota Ronaldo, actually has a Fight to Win Pro Jiu-Jitsu tournament that it's going to be televised, I believe, on Flow Grappling. So that's going to be up in a couple of weeks that he goes up over there in Dallas.
That's awesome. I look forward to that. Also, the Brood, they had a very interesting comeback in the game on Saturday.
Yes, they did.
We were playing a team from Grayford, which is another town about 35 miles away. And apparently this team was very good, undefeated, hadn't been beaten by anybody. And they played really good. It was a close ball game. Our team normally blows people out. And this one, we took the lead early. They tied us, and then they were actually beating us. And we managed, in the very last inning, to get Jacob the Brood
La Flama Blanca.
On third base, we had 2 outs with a weaker part of our lineup coming up to bat. And I was like, man, this is going to be in trouble. And their pitcher overthrew the catcher, and Jacob stole home for the win.
With the broke toe and all.
So the boys were pumped. They were super stoked. So. But we got another game this week, and then another game on Saturday. But that's about it for me. Work today. This week's going to be pretty normal, I think.
Good.
Pretty much just sticking to it. I know we got to get ready for Halloween coming up. We got to finalize what the Brood are going to be for Halloween, because I told you it changes.
Are you going to force Luke? Now you're going to have to force him to make a decision.
We just make all of them. We wait till 4 days before, because if you buy it too early, then you have to end up buying 5 or 6 costumes by the time Halloween gets here. So I will give everybody an update when they decide what they're going to be. I'll probably even Instagram the photos if you want to follow the Brood on their journey. But I hope everybody has an excellent week. If you'd like to share a story of your own, you can email the show at expandedperspectives@yahoo.com. You can also call the show 817-945-3828. I hope everybody has an excellent week. Please, for God's sake, stay out of trouble. I'm Kyle Filson. He's Cam Hale.
Go Cubs. Peace.